Every couple of years, we hear another strange, sensational claim about Jesus. We read another Time magazine article or see another documentary on HBO. Maybe we read he was a political revolutionary, not a spiritual leader. Or he married Mary Magdalene and had children. Or his tomb was discovered with his body still in it. Or he didn't exist at all. So, who was the historical Jesus? Behind all of the sensationalism and headline grabbing and trying to sell advertising spots and sell newspapers, who was the historical Jesus? Really, we can separate out two different questions. One is what actually happened in the past, and the other is what should everyone, even atheists, agree about based on the evidence? And when scholars talk about the historical Jesus, usually they're talking about the latter, the sketch of Jesus that's not complete, but that includes all of the elements of Jesus' life that historians can agree about based on the evidence. That sketch presumes that Jesus did exist. And despite Dan Brown's recent claims to the contrary, every historian of the historical Jesus of early Christianity agrees that Jesus existed as a real human being in Galilee and Judea near the beginning of the first century. That's not in debate among any scholars. The only people who raise the question of his existence are pop writers on blogs and novelists. Why are we so confident that Jesus existed? Well, within 5 years of his death, we see a movement grow up that looks to him as its founder. So presumably, there was something to start that early Christian movement. Something happened, and what they say happened is there was a man in Judea and in Galilee who taught them. This is so taken for granted that not even Jesus' opponents ever argued that he hadn't existed. Later on, in later decades, when the opponents of Christianity, Jewish and Gentile, argued against the resurrection of Jesus, argued against the validity of his teachings, they never argued that he hadn't existed at all. And in fact, those same followers who all presumed that he had existed as a real human being were willing to suffer and die for this person that they had known, that they had heard about. So this is why historians say we have at least as good evidence for the reality and the existence of Jesus as we do for any other historical figure in the ancient world. So if we say, no, Jesus didn't really exist, despite all the evidence we have to essentially say we know nothing about the ancient world at all. Well, historians recognize that that's foolish. But what are our sources of knowledge about Jesus? How do we figure out, as historians, who he was, what he did, what he said? Our best pieces of evidence are the writings of the New Testament. The 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were all written within the first century. So if Jesus died either in 30 or 33 AD, and Mark's Gospel is written sometime before 70 AD, that means that Mark is writing within 40 years at most of the events that he's talking about. Well, that's certainly within the time frame when Mark had access to eyewitnesses. And in fact, the early church tradition tells us that Mark was the interpreter of Peter, and that the teaching we read in Mark's gospel is actually the writing down of Peter's oral teaching that he taught for 40 years before it was finally codified by Peter. In other words, we have here at second hand eyewitness testimony in the Gospel of Mark. That makes it really valuable as a historical document. And almost the same thing can be said about the other canonical Gospels. Matthew and Luke are probably written sometime in the 80s. The Gospel of John probably not until sometime in the 90s AD. But that still means that all four canonical Gospels were written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses of Jesus' life. And within communities where those eyewitnesses traveled around and spoke and taught. And so even with the other Gospels, what we have here is, at second hand, the memory of eyewitnesses. That makes, again, our study of Jesus radically different from the study of most ancient figures. Most of the history that we rely on for ancient Rome, for the Empire of Alexander the Great, most of those historians that we look to and learn about in history classes are writing centuries after the events that they're describing. They make the best effort they can to use good sources, but they just don't have the kind of immediate, first-hand accounts that we have for Jesus in the four canonical Gospels. On top of that, we have Paul's letters. Now, why would those be useful for the historical Jesus? Because periodically, when Paul is writing to his churches about other things, he'll, in passing, mention, that Jesus was descended from David. Or he'll mention the tradition that he was taught by the apostles about the different resurrection appearances. He is writing earlier than the earliest of the Gospels. So his letters are written within 20 to 30 years of the death of Jesus. And already at that early point, Paul can just assume that everyone in his churches knows the basic story as we see it more or less in the canonical gospel writings. Are there any sources besides the Gospels? Well, we hear a lot often of the so-called Gnostic Gospels and similar writings, and the idea is sometimes suggested that these give us somehow a better picture of Jesus than the canonical writings do of the New Testament. But most historians of all stripes, of all faith backgrounds, would say that's nonsense. All of the documents that we know as the Gnostic Gospels were written in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries. In other words, they are all written about 100 or more years after our sources in the New Testament are. They're written after the time when all of the eyewitnesses have died. They're written after the time when any trustworthy oral tradition about Jesus had died out. And so just based on their origins, we would, as historians, hold them somewhat suspect. Add to that the fact that most of the Gnostic Gospels make their claim to authenticity by saying, there were public Gospels, the four Gospels, that the apostles gave to just everybody, and that was based on Jesus' public teaching, but Jesus had secret teaching that he only revealed to one of the apostles. And that apostle handed it down generation to generation secretly until now, 100, 200, 300 years later, I'm telling you what the secret teaching was. Historically, that doesn't sound very plausible, does it? It sounds a lot like the rhetorical move of some teacher who wants to revise Christianity and wants to somehow use the apostles' authority to do it. But they know that the apostles' public teaching is well known and is captured in the four Gospels. So how do they do it? They claim some secret teaching. Of course, those Gnostic Gospels were never accepted, any individual one, by more than a handful of Christians. And precisely because people said, we don't know where these come from. We don't know whether you're right, that you have some sort of secret teaching. And besides, the Jesus that is described in this secret book doesn't sound very much like the Jesus that we see in the Synoptic Gospels. And when you read the Gnostic Gospels, you can clearly see the influence of 2nd and 3rd century Greek philosophy, which had become quite mystical. And the Jesus that appears in those documents doesn't sound like a 1st century Jew from Galilee. He doesn't say the things that a 1st century Jew from Galilee would say. He says the kinds of things that a philosopher, a Neoplatonist from the 2nd or 3rd century would say. So for all of these reasons, the vast majority of scholars say whatever we do with the Gnostic Gospels, we shouldn't use them as a source for history. They tell us more about the small minority groups that were writing them than they tell us anything about Jesus. The one exception here is the Gospel of Thomas, which was written probably during the 1st century AD. And it's a tricky book to work with, partly because we don't know who wrote it. It didn't circulate widely among the followers of the apostles the way the canonical Gospels did. And so we're not sure exactly where it came from or who wrote it. And it contains some sayings of Jesus from the Synoptic Gospels and some sayings of Jesus that we don't know from anywhere else. The difficulty is that when we see sayings of Jesus that also come in the Synoptic Gospels show up in the Gospel of Thomas, all of the story context is stripped away from those sayings. And they become so cryptic that it's impossible to know what Jesus would have meant by them. So, for example, if you take the saying, the words of Jesus telling us to let the dead bury their own dead. Well, if you just include that saying with no context, what in the world does it mean? Nothing. Nothing that we can discern. And a lot of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas are exactly like that. It's in the Synoptic Gospels that we're given the context from Jesus' life for that saying. A follower coming to him saying, I want to follow you, but wait, let me just go back and bury my parents. And Jesus calling for faith that makes him the first priority in life. And so saying, let the dead bury their own dead. Don't wait, don't put it off because something else is more important. Come and follow me now. So because the sayings are so contextless and so cryptic, and we don't know what the original contexts were for the sayings that are unique to the Gospel of Thomas, really for practical purposes, the Gospel of Thomas isn't a very good historical source either. So historians, by and large, whether they're believers in Christ, whether they're Jewish, whether they're atheist or agnostic, the broad consensus is that our best primary sources for knowing anything about who Jesus was are the 4 Gospels that we find in the New Testament. That's good news. Now, when we look at those Gospels, how do we evaluate them as historians? Well, historians look at the Gospels and they ask, are these people whose words we can trust? Are they people who had access to good information? Yes, they are. Are they people who are trying to give us accurate information? Well, it seems like yes, particularly given that, again, these same writers are in communities where people were giving their lives for the same Jesus that they're describing. Yeah, they were honest. They were trying to give us true information. From a historian's standpoint, that doesn't mean they were perfect about it, but it at least means we need to take seriously what they wrote. The second problem is that it's very difficult for historians to confirm or deny specific events in the Gospels. So if you want to ask about a specific saying of Jesus, or if you want to ask about a specific act that he performed, the historian finds it difficult to really have much in the way of criteria to decide whether that saying was actually said by Jesus or that action was performed by Jesus. But what historians can do is say there are patterns of action and patterns of speech that we find in the Gospels, that because it's a pattern, we can say it's repeated over and over in multiple sources, and so it probably does reflect what Jesus did or what Jesus said. So what kind of sketch of Jesus do we get when we look then with historical eyes at these patterns of action and speech? There are certain key events that we know happened, that Jesus appeared in 27 AD as a charismatic leader in Judea and in Galilee, that he was baptized by John the Baptist. Why that event? Well, because nobody would have invented that for him. That he was crucified at Passover in Jerusalem in either 30 or 33 AD, and that crucifixion was a political one, that he was crucified as a political threat to the Romans because, in some sense, he had claimed to be the king of the Jews. Beyond that, what were Jesus' activities like? Well, we know he was a Torah-observant Jew, a law-observant Jew. And sometimes people like John Dominic Crossan have tried to argue that, no, Jesus was actually very Hellenized, and he was influenced by Stoic and Cynic philosophy. So he was a traveling philosopher, and all of this Jewish stuff was just overlaid over top of him. That depends for its plausibility on the old idea that the city closest to Nazareth, which was called Sepphoris, was a very Greek city. And so the idea runs, when Jesus and his father took their craftsmanship down from Nazareth to the city, or went to work on building projects in the city of Sepphoris, which was just down the ridge from Nazareth, they would have picked up all of this Greek philosophy and Greek culture. Subsequent research, though, has shown that, in fact, in the first century, Sepphoris was a very Jewish city and had very little Greek philosophy in it at all. So that picture of Jesus as really being highly Greek, really being some kind of philosopher, now historians would agree that's pretty implausible. Jesus was Jewish through and through, and traditionally Jewish. He was known as a healer and exorcist. Now, atheist historians won't necessarily agree that Jesus actually healed people or actually drove out demons, but they agree that he was known as a healer and an exorcist, that the people around Jesus at least believed that they were being healed by him and that they were seeing demons cast out. Jesus was clearly a wisdom teacher, a traditional Jewish teacher who used parables and figurative sayings as his main mode of teaching. He was active mostly in rural Galilee and only came down to Jerusalem for festivals like Passover. He was known for associating with sinners, with prostitutes, with tax collectors, drunkards, people who were on the margins of respectable Jewish society. Those were the people that he was known for going and having a party with. We also can be fairly sure that Jesus gathered disciples, a broad circle of disciples, then within that an inner circle of 12, and within that 3 chief disciples, Peter, James, and John. We can be fairly sure that those disciples saw him do things which they believed only God could do, whether it was declare somebody's sins forgiven or calming a storm. And strangely, his followers didn't disband when he was crucified. They didn't give up and say, okay, we were wrong, this wasn't the Messiah. Instead, they immediately began to claim that they were encountering him physically in a risen body that would appear to them in various times and places to different groups of people. That much, all historians, by and large, can agree on, whatever their background is. And I think what's encouraging is that although that's not quite the full Jesus of the Gospels, that means that the strictly historical evidence gives us a sketch of Jesus, that is pretty close to what we read in the Synoptic Gospels, and it's pretty close to the Jesus that we believe in by faith. The trick is that there are limits to history. At some point, the believer and the atheist have to disagree about what actually happened back then. We have to decide whether when Jesus was known as a healer, he was actually healing people, or whether people were just duped by him. We have to decide what that event was that all of the early Christians said was an appearance of the risen Christ. These kinds of decisions aren't ones that we can make strictly on a historical basis. Why? Because they're the kinds of decisions that have a worldview-changing impact on us. If I admit that Jesus rose from the dead, then everything else is changed. If I admit that Jesus healed, that he raised people from the dead, then everything else is changed. And so those sorts of decisions can't just be the probabilistic decisions that we make as historians, where we say, well, based on all the other kinds of events that happen, we can say, yeah, this is a plausible event. Because the resurrection, Jesus' healings, these were things that were not ordinary events. They're not repeatable events that historians can look at and say, yes, that fits a normal human pattern, and so it's plausible. But that also means that historians can't prove that they didn't happen. There's no historical evidence conflicting with those claims. It's just that from a historian's point of view, the resurrection is like a gap in the sketch that we can draw of Jesus. And we have testimony, people telling us what they believe was in that gap in the story. But it's not until we make a decision about Jesus that we can fill in that gap one way or the other. Either saying there must have been something to happen, mass hysteria or something that made people think they were seeing Jesus, or we choose to fill in the gap the other way and allow our lives to be changed by the admission that, they were saying Jesus was raised because he actually rose from the dead. This is where those two kinds of historical Jesus come together. The sketch that I'll agree with the atheist, and the full picture that the gospel gives us, that we put our trust in. So we have to move beyond the historical Jesus, whether we're believers or whether we're atheists or agnostics. We end up making a decision about how to fill in those gaps that can only be filled in by faith of one kind or another. And I think there are at least two ways that we can approach that decision. We can ask, do I experience the same Jesus that's depicted in those gospel writings? And if I do, if I've seen people healed in the name of that Jesus, then that is going to make it much easier for me to say, I think when the disciples said he healed, when the disciples said they saw him raised from the dead, they were right. We can also ask ourselves, am I willing to bet my life on that testimony? Or am I willing to bet my life on the fact that it was wrong? We have to make a calculated decision one way or the other about which to trust. What's most important At the end of the day, for us, though, is to know that historical investigation has not unearthed any skeletons. There is no hidden evidence. There are no secret documents in the basement of the Vatican that would somehow overturn all of our belief in Jesus. The sketch that we can agree on with the atheist about the historical Jesus is a sketch that looks an awful lot like the Jesus we have put our faith in. And there is nothing to conflict historically, no evidence to conflict with our conviction by faith that he was actually raised from the dead, that he did actually heal and cast out demons. And so history isn't something that we have to fear. History is something that we can look at with wide open eyes and great confidence, because what happened back there, what actually happened in the life of that man Jesus, all of the evidence that we have points to it having been exactly what we believe. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't some other problems and issues that I'll talk about again in a few weeks with certain parts of the gospel stories, but it means that the Jesus of the Gospels as a whole is the real Jesus. It's one that we are historically justified in putting our faith in. And when we see the Time magazine article with a big sensational question mark over the face of Jesus, we can rest assured that this is a grab for advertising dollars, but that historically speaking, we're on solid ground. Amen.
We have a faithful